Sarah Yarborough made one small mistake that morning. She thought she was late. She rushed out the door in her drill team uniform, rollers still in her hair, and drove to school almost an hour early. But the real problem wasn't that she was late. She was alone. A little while later, two boys taking a shortcut saw something in the bushes. Then they looked closer, and at first, they thought they were staring at a mannequin lying on the frozen ground. But mannequins don't have red hair, and mannequins don't wear hair rollers. And when the boys looked back up, a man was sitting in his car watching them. For more than 30 years, no one knew his name, but the investigators finally found out who he was. The most disturbing part wasn't what he did to Sarah. No, it was his true identity, and it only made things worse. Sarah Yarborough was a 16-year-old high school student who'd been born in Portland, Oregon. But by the time this case took place, her family was living in Federal Way, Washington. They'd moved there with Sarah when she was only 8 years old. And in many ways, Federal Way had become the place where she was growing into the person that everyone around her loved so deeply. Sarah had two younger brothers, and at the time, she was attending Federal Way High School. She was bright, responsible, and curious. She loved math, science, and art, and she was also part of the high school drill team and dance club. She had the kind of busy teenage life that seems ordinary to the outside, but means everything to the people who are living in it. Practices, friends, family, school commitments, and the feeling that life is just beginning. Her mother, Laura, described Sarah as the highlight of her life, and her friends said her personality matched her vibrant red hair. Fiery, vibrant, and almost impossible not to notice. She was friendly, she was sociable, she was energetic, and according to her family, she'd make friends with nearly anyone. But as we've come to realize, in true crime cases, this trait is often true for people who become victims. But Sarah was not only outgoing, she was also deeply protective of the people she loved, especially her younger brothers. She helped them with homework, looked after them, and shared a bond with them that her family would later describe as incredibly close. And that detail matters because the more you understand who Sarah was, the more devastating this case becomes. She was responsible for her age. She was helpful, and she was not the kind of teenager who would always be pushing limits or trying to disappear from her parents' view. She was a normal 16-year-old girl with school, friends, family, and a future in front of her. And then one cold December morning, all of that ended just yards away from a place where she should have been safe. The day before everything happened was a Friday, December 13th, 1991. And yes, it was Friday the 13th, but strangely enough, that was not the actual day that everything went wrong. For Sarah, that Friday passed like any other. The Yarborough family had plans to leave town for the weekend and travel to Ocean Shores for her brother's soccer game. Now, Ocean Shores was about 2 hours away from Federal Way, and Sarah was supposed to go with them, but she had an important drill competition the next day and she didn't want to miss it. Her mother was hesitant to leave her 16-year-old daughter behind, but Sarah had given her parents every reason to trust her. She was responsible, wasn't planning to party, and hadn't really been getting into any trouble. She simply wanted to keep a school commitment. So her parents agreed, but only on one condition. A friend had to stay with her overnight. It was the kind of rule that just made sense. Sarah would not be completely alone. Her parents could still go to the soccer game, and everyone had a plan that felt safe. To Sarah, that probably felt like the perfect arrangement. She was going to stay home, go to her competition, spend the night with a friend, and so one of her friends came over with an overnight bag, and the two girls went to a school basketball game. And afterward, they stopped for snacks and went to the house, watched TV, and went to bed. Nothing about that night seemed dangerous. There was no warning sign, no strange call, no decision that seemed reckless in that moment. Nothing suggested that Sarah was about to cross paths with someone who would change the rest of her family's life. The next morning, December 14th, Sarah woke up and believed she was running late. Now, it's not clear if she misread the time or simply panicked when she woke up, but she rushed to get ready. She put on her drill team uniform, left her rollers in her hair, and said goodbye to her friend and just got into her car and drove straight to Federal Way High School. The drill team was supposed to board a bus from the high school and head to Juanita High School in Kirkland for that competition. But Sarah would never make it on that bus. And in reality, she wasn't late at all. The team was not supposed to meet until around 9 a.m., but Sarah arrived closer to 8. That meant that she had almost an hour to wait at the school alone on a cold Saturday morning when very few people were around. And that empty hour is where everything changed. Sarah was not the only teenager awake and out and about that morning. Two other boys, 13-year-old Drew Miller and his friend Adam, had spent the night at Drew's house, and after breakfast they decided to go skateboarding near a grocery store close to Federal Way High School. And to get there, they took a shortcut. They climbed over a fence, followed a trail that passed near the school, and, well, it was December, so it was pretty cold outside. There were puddles frozen all along this trail, and the path was lined with these thick bushes. There were no crowds, no teachers, no parents dropping kids off because it's Saturday, and no real reason for anyone to be hiding there. The boys were just being kids, walking through this frozen path, hearing the ice and snow crunch under their feet, when Adam suddenly saw something that made him stop. A man was coming out of the bushes. At first, that alone did not seem like proof of anything. The boys thought maybe he'd been hiding there to smoke or do something that he didn't want anyone to see. It was strange, but not automatically terrifying. But still, something about it felt off. The man walked ahead of them towards his car, and as the boys passed the place where he'd come out of the bushes, they looked behind the brush. That was when they saw what they thought was a mannequin. It was lying on the cold ground, and it looked real. But in their minds, they didn't want to accept that it could be real. And then they noticed the hair. Mannequins don't have red hair, and they don't have rollers in their hair. And that's when the boys understood they were not looking at a mannequin at all. They were looking at a young girl, unresponsive on the ground. Their ordinary morning turned into something horrifying in one single second. And when they looked back towards the man they had just seen coming from the bushes, he was now sitting in his car, watching them. The boys froze. They were confused, terrified, and too young to fully even process what they had just walked into. And then instinct took over. They turned around and ran as fast as they could back to Drew's house because they needed the police. And they had every reason to wonder if they were in danger too. But thankfully, they made it home safely, and Drew's parents were told about what they had seen. And police and emergency services were called, and they were there within minutes. And that quiet shortcut near that school was now filled with officers, paramedics, and flashing lights. When first responders first arrived, they found exactly what the boys described. A young girl with red hair wearing a Federal Way high school drill team uniform lying on the cold ground. It was Sarah Yarborough. She'd left that morning for a competition, but she never even made it out of the school parking area. Investigators searched the scene, and soon enough they found her car abandoned 100 yards away from where her body had been discovered. It was clear Sarah had driven herself to the school, but what happened after that was much harder to understand. Inside her car, nothing looked chaotic. There were no obvious signs of a major struggle. Her belongings were all still there, and even a pack of orange juice was just sitting there undisturbed on the front seat. That detail is eerie because it makes the scene feel suspended in time, as though Sarah simply walked away for just a moment, and she was supposed to come right back. That told investigators something important and also disturbing. Whatever happened to Sarah may not have started with some violent ambush inside the car. It was possible that the attacker approached her, spoke to her, and somehow convinced her to get out and walk towards that isolated area where she was later found. And because Sarah was known as someone who was kind and willing to help, investigators wondered if that kindness had been used against her. Maybe this person asked her for help. Maybe this person created a problem. And maybe they said just enough to get this responsible teenage girl out of her car. And if they did, then Sarah's last act of ordinary kindness may have been the very thing that put her in danger. However it happened, Sarah ended up alone with someone who had no business being near her. DNA was recovered from her body, and that did give investigators hope. But in 1991, having DNA did not mean what it means today. They had a profile, but no match. They had evidence, but no name. So for the moment, the only people who had seen the person responsible were the two shaken boys who'd stumbled into the aftermath by accident. Police knew that foul play was involved from the very beginning, and their attention centered on the man that Drew and Adam had seen coming out of those bushes. The boys were the only witnesses in the case, so investigators worked with them to create a composite sketch. That sketch was shared across the area, on the news, and anywhere police thought might bring in a lead. But despite that attention, the case did not break open. Tips came in, investigators followed them, people called with names, theories, and other possible sightings, but one by one, the leads either fell apart or went nowhere. Over time, the calls slowed down, the investigation cooled, and the question that mattered the most remained: who killed Sarah Yarborough? In June of 1993, about a year and a half after Sarah had been killed, a memorial bench was placed in the Federal Way High School courtyard in her honor. It included pieces of Sarah's life, images of her dog, her ballet shoes, books, and her favorite motto, Carpe Diem. Graduation came and went without her. Her friends moved forward, but with an empty space where Sarah should have been. She did not get to accept her diploma. She didn't go to college. She didn't get to chase the dreams that she used to talk about, whether that meant becoming an engineer one day or maybe a museum curator the next. For her family, time didn't move the same way that it moved for everyone else. Life continued, but Sarah was always missing from it. There are families who lose someone and then they slowly begin to learn to carry that grief. But in Sarah's case, grief came with a second wound. The person who did this was still unnamed. Her brothers grew up without the sister who protected them. Her parents lived with that kind of guilt that no parent should have to carry, replaying the decision to leave her home alone that weekend and wondering what might have happened if one small detail had changed. Meanwhile, the case remained open, but the truth seemed farther away with every passing year. Investigators still had the DNA, they still had the boy's description, but neither one could give the family what they needed the most: a face, a name, and an arrest. But then, time did something unsuspected. It gave investigators a tool they had not even thought of in 1991. DNA technology advanced, and cold cases that once seemed impossible now looked different. Evidence had been sitting for years, and it could now be tested in new ways. Profiles that had no match could now be compared through different methods that didn't even exist when Sarah was killed. And eventually, Sarah's case became one of the cases that would help prove just how powerful those methods could be. It would not be quick, and it would not erase the decades Sarah's family had already lost, but it gave investigators a path forward where every other path had gone cold. Years after Sarah's murder, investigators turned to forensic genetic genealogy. The basic idea is that an unknown DNA sample can be compared to public DNA databases and family trees, not necessarily to find the suspect directly, but to find relatives. And from there, investigators can work backward and forward through the family until they find a person that starts to come into focus. At the time, this approach was still new and controversial. Some people in law enforcement were skeptical. Others wondered whether it would actually hold up or whether it would waste more time in cases that had already gone cold. But in cases like Sarah's, where police had DNA but no match, even a distant family connection could be the first real movement in years. But Sarah's case needed something new. The DNA profile was compared through genealogical research, and eventually a surname emerged: Fuller. The name stunned people in the Yarborough family because there was a Fuller already connected to them. Bill Fuller was a family friend. He'd supported the family after Sarah's death, and he'd even helped build the memorial bench at the school. So at first, the discovery felt impossible. Was someone close to the family connected to Sarah's murder? Well, the answer was complicated. Bill Fuller did not match the description of the man seen by Drew and Adam. He was older, he had no apparent reason to hurt Sarah, and when he voluntarily gave his DNA, it didn't match the evidence from the crime scene. But the genealogy work suggested that Bill and the killer shared the same paternal family line. In other words, we're not looking at Bill Fuller himself, they were looking at someone in his extended family. And that narrowed down the search, but it did not end it. More years passed and more testing was done. More family lines were examined, and investigators kept working the case until 2019, when the suspect pool was narrowed down to 2 brothers. One brother was ruled out because his DNA had already been in the criminal database and it didn't match the killer's profile. And that left one man, Patrick Leon Nicholas. At the time of his arrest, Patrick was 55 years old. Police began watching him because they needed one thing to be sure. his DNA. See, Patrick was a smoker, and investigators eventually collected discarded cigarette butts from him. They also obtained a used napkin. Those items were enough to test, and when the results came back, they matched the DNA from Sarah's case. After nearly 3 decades, investigators finally had the name they had been chasing. The Fuller surname had pointed them towards the right family line, and the reason that Patrick's last name had been different from that of his grandfather is because he was adopted. Once that piece made sense, the genealogy work locked into place. And what made the moment even more chilling was that Patrick bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch that Drew and Adam had helped create all those years earlier. Those boys had only been 13 when they saw the man near the bushes, but what they remembered mattered. Their account had helped preserve the face of a suspect long before science could help finally put a name to him. But the most disturbing discovery was not just that Patrick matched the evidence, it was that the investigators learned about this man's past, and Patrick had a history of violence against women. All the way back in 1983, years before Sarah's murder, a woman named Anne was sitting in her car near the Columbia River when Patrick, who was just 19 at the time, approached her and made small talk at first. But when she tried to leave, he threatened her with a weapon and forced her towards an isolated area near the river. Now, thankfully, Anne escaped by jumping into the water to get away. But Patrick tried to flee and police caught up to him before he could disappear. And once they looked closer, they learned this was not his first sign of violence. His record included serious crimes from back when he was a juvenile. His pattern was already there. He would approach a woman, use a weapon to fear or control her, and then force her towards isolation. That's what makes his history so important in Sarah's case. This was not a man who had never shown any warning signs. This man was clearly a repeated offender. He pleaded guilty in Anne's case, and at her request, he received the maximum sentence, 10 years. But he didn't serve 10 years. He was released after just 4. That detail is crushing in hindsight, because if Patrick had served his full sentence, he would have still been in prison when Sarah Yarborough was killed. But instead, he was free. And not long after Sarah's murder, his name surfaced again. In 1993, Patrick was convicted in a case involving his 6-year-old stepdaughter. The charges were eventually reduced to gross misdemeanor, and once again, the sentence was shockingly lenient. And even after all that, his DNA was not entered into a criminal database in a way that would have helped Sarah's case be solved earlier. That is one of the most frustrating parts of this story. Investigators had DNA from Sarah's case. They had a witness sketch. They had a man with a violent history. But because the right connection was never made, Sarah's family waited for almost 30 years for an answer. Patrick Nicholas finally went to trial for Sarah Yarborough's murder in April of 2023. By then, more than 31 years had passed since Sarah had driven to school in her drill uniform and never came home. The prosecution argued that Patrick saw Sarah alone that morning and targeted her. She was a young girl sitting by herself near a school with almost no one else around. Investigators believed he lured her out of her car and into the most isolated area under some kind of pretense, possibly asking for help, and Sarah's kindness may have been the very thing that he then used to get close to her. And the defense tried to challenge the case in several ways. They questioned the use of forensic genealogy, especially because the technology had been used early in the development. They also argued that Patrick was not necessarily the man that Drew and Adam saw near those bushes, even though his appearance strongly resembled the sketch created after the murder. The trial lasted a little over 2 weeks. For Sarah's family, those weeks were the end of a wait that lasted longer than Sarah herself had even been alive. Her loved ones had been through memorials, anniversaries, birthdays, graduation day, and decades of ordinary life continuing without her. Every year of grief, every unanswered question, and every false lead, and even every hope that rose and fell, all of it now came down to the jury. And when the verdict came back, Patrick was found not guilty of premeditated first-degree murder. But he was found guilty of first-degree murder committed during the commission of attempted assault, and second-degree murder during the commission of indecent liberties. The defense asked for a lighter sentence of around 20 years, but the state pushed for 45 or more. And in the end, Patrick was sentenced to 45 years in prison, meaning he will almost certainly spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Drew Miller, who was now in his 40s, the sentencing brought relief. He'd been one of the boys who found Sarah that morning, one of the only witnesses to the man leaving the bushes, and one of the only people who carried that memory for decades. For the Yarborough family, justice had finally arrived, but it arrived painfully late. Sarah was still gone. Her parents still lost their daughter. Her brothers still lost the sister who had loved and protected them. Her friends still lost the fiery, red-haired girl who should have grown up with them. And what makes this case so haunting is not just the brutality of what had happened. It's the ordinary morning Sarah was stolen from. The school parking lot, the drill uniform, the rollers in her hair, the competition she never reached. Sarah Yarborough was doing what a responsible teenage girl was supposed to do. And for more than 30 years, the man who took her life walked around with a name no one knew. These sorts of cases are some of the most haunting. Sarah wasn't out drinking with friends. She wasn't out asking for trouble. She wasn't dating someone her parents had warned her about a dozen times. She was just doing her best to live a quiet, productive life. And still, somehow, she got taken away. But the most disturbing part of all is that this story is nothing new. It's a tale as old as time. You can think all the way back to the times of Cain and Abel 6,000 years ago. Abel wasn't murdered because he was doing something wrong. He was killed because he was doing something right. Evil always finds a way. Sarah's story is not a warning that she did something wrong. It's a reminder that tragedy is not always explainable, it's not always fair, and it's not always tied to someone's choices. Sometimes evil finds the innocent because our world is critically broken and because wicked people continue to choose darkness.